Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literary Fiction Panel. I'm Andrea Gough, an Adult Services Librarian at the Seattle Public Library. I'll be moderating this session on literary fiction novels that explore themes of belonging, found family, and storytelling. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Amy Bloom, author of I'll Be Right Here, forthcoming from Random House, Penguin Random House in June. Natalie Guerrero, author of My Train Leaves at 3, out in July from One World, Penguin Random House. Adam Johnson, The Wayfinder, coming in October from MCD Macmillan. He may or may not be able to join us today, but we're holding space. Allison Larkin, author of Home of the American Circus, out in May from Gallery Books, Simon & Schuster. And Kathy Wang, author of The Satisfaction Café, forthcoming from Scribner, Simon & Schuster this July. So welcome, everybody. And we're going to just jump right in. Our first question is for Allison. In your novel, Home of the American Circus, a personal emergency forces Freya Arnolds to return home 10 years after leaving and cutting all ties with family and friends. Living in the dilapidated house she inherited from her recently deceased parents, Freya reconnects with her teenage niece Aubrey, reckoning with her complicated family history as she builds a community that sustains her. What drew you to telling this story?
It's really interesting because this story had such a long progression. In 2013, we were packing up our house to sell, and I was living in Rochester. My husband was already out in California. So I was reading a lot and watching a lot of movies and TV shows and things like that. And I'd watched like a string of things that were very male homecoming stories. Like I was watching a lot of Ed Burns movies. I'd watched a series called October Road, which is about a writer who's going home as a hometown hero. And there are all these like hometown heroes going home to conquer the young woman. And also at the same time, a lot of what was happening was these movies about women who were, the plucky magazine writer in New York City who had her career together but was looking for love. And I kept thinking about how I wanted to see a character who was a little bit of a loser, who didn't have her life together. I really wanted to see that, and I wanted a homecoming story about a woman and the complications of that. And so that's when it started spinning. And then over the years, I had these moments of realizing, oh, it's this, oh, it's this, oh, she's going to inherit the house. Like at first, it was just a story about Freya going home and having this complicated relationship with her friend Jam. And then you start looking at like, okay, well, what else does she have to deal with? What are the other challenges? And then at some point later, I realized where I had to set the story. But it was something that was living with me for a very long time, and it was just a lot of different inspirations.
I love that. Thank you. And yeah, we're going to dig into the setting in a little bit as well. Kathy, in The Satisfaction Cafe, readers follow Joan Liang as she spends a lifetime searching for a sense of belonging. From immigrating to California from Taiwan, through 2 marriages and the effort required navigating predominantly white spaces, to the dream of building a cafe where all would feel welcome. How did the idea of The Satisfaction Cafe and Joan's story come to you?
Okay, so just to provide a quick summary first of what the Satisfaction Cafe as a business actually is, it's a real cafe which serves food and drink, and it's also a place where someone can visit to feel a little less alone. And how that second part is achieved is really through a group of hosts that work there who each kind of specialize in different areas. So there's someone that can sit and give you like motherly approval for all your life choices. There's someone who can like just listen patiently and look very interested if you tell a really long story about resentment you have with like a childhood friend. There's like a casting agent who can tell you objectively, very gently, like how good looking you actually are. Um, so that's, the list goes on. And then the cafe itself, it's really the culmination of one woman, Joan's life work. The novel really follows the arc of her life, and the cafe comes out when she's well into middle age. It comes at a point when she's taking stock of her life and she's got some resources and freedom. And so because of that, and from that, I really wanted to imagine the kind of business someone might open if they really created it just for their dreams with no real limitations. Like I think I had also just been thinking about like, you always read about these billionaires and they're always doing the same things. Like they're building mega yachts or going into space, sometimes very briefly. And I was always like, why wouldn't they just create some amazing space like this instead? It just seems like such a nicer legacy. And so I decided to do that here.
I think a lot of readers are going to finish the book wishing they could go to the Satisfaction Cafe. So you've created a sense of yearning, is what I'll say. Natalie, in your novel, My Train Leaves at 3, Xiomara has always had one goal, Broadway stardom. 2 years after her sister's sudden death, Xiomara is still grappling with that loss, struggling to pay rent, fighting with family, and getting involved in dubious relationships. She struggles to stay true to herself and to find a path to this future she's long dreamt of. So this is your debut novel. What drew you to Xiomara's story?
Yeah. First off, I just need to say I do need to go to a Satisfaction Cafe. So I'm very excited, Kathy. We need to offline about this. What drew me to Xiomara's story? There were a lot of things. So actually, initially, when I set out to write this novel, to your point, it's my debut novel. And I thought I wanted to write a book about women in the workplace and the complicated relationships they have with their male bosses. And when I was writing my first sentence, it kind of like vomited out of me that she was going through grief. And so then I started examining this idea of grief and also who gets to have a complicated dream and also who gets to be happy here in America. My family is a family of immigrants. And so I had this, I've always had this yearning for wanting to see a woman on a quest to be happy. And I feel like I've seen a lot of novels, especially around white women, on that quest to be happy, like on their eat, pray, love journey. And I really wanted to find a woman who I saw myself in, who could be on that quest unapologetically and also incredibly messily. And so I kind of found Xiomara's story through that kind of yearning and want. And then there were some other fun elements, like I'm a theater nerd and I grew up on Broadway musicals, and I had this want to find hope and joy for Xiomara. And so that world really called to me. And I found such a beautiful marriage in like the hope and the performance elements for her. And when do you get to take your mask off, and who are you performing for, and where can you be fully yourself? And I've always found that place is home. So those were the big themes that kind of drew me to X's story, and then she kind of guided me from there.
Love that. Thank you. Amy, in I'll Be Right Here, or I'll Be Right Here spans from Paris pre-World War II to upstate New York in 2015, following Algerian French Ghazala as she builds a community around herself. From finding refuge during the war with the writer Colette, to immigrating to the United States and falling in with the Cohen girls, Anne and Alma, and the way the three build a sprawling, unconventional family over 3 generations. So why this story now?
There we go. I don't know that the writer ever knows exactly why this story now. My kids say that I have 4 subjects in various order, depending on which child, but basically love, family, sex, and death. And they are correct. Those are the things that I write about. And they're almost always in the context of found family. And I think for me, I became a mother when I was 21. And I would say that shaped my entire life in terms of family and children and being a daughter and being a mother and what is required and what is given. And I am very drawn to, I'm very drawn to messiness because I am drawn to human beings. And, the idea that the character will come and tell you is something that I always love. Alice Walker used to say that her characters would come down the hall and sit at the end of her bed and tell her their stories. I do not have that experience. If somebody is sitting at the end of my bed, they are saying something like, is there any Advil? They are not saying, let me share my inner workings with you. I have to hear them. I have to know them before I can sort of bring it to life. And this book, I think for me, was also about how unknown we are to each other, even in a family, regardless of blood. But I am aware that my grandparents were not real people to me. They were furniture, they were the refrigerator, they were the pull-out sofa bed, but they were not, I did not see them as human. I didn't see my parents as human beings. I didn't know my mother had been a really successful journalist until I was 40 years old, when I sort of came upon an album of her clippings. You know, I didn't know my grandfather was deported from Russia because he was both a criminal and a union organizer, until, again, I was in my own middle age. So I really wanted to write about what we don't see, what we don't hear. I did not come from a family in which people had sort of the modern impulse to share and reveal and say things like, let me tell you how I feel about this. I came from the kind of family where when I said to my grandmother, who had extremely limited English, so Grandma, what was it like in the old country? She said, not so nice. And I thought, there are all the questions, there are all the mysteries. And I wanted to write about how some things are revealed and some mysteries are preserved, both for good and for bad, and how that gets passed through families, all of those things.
Thank you. We're going to dig into a bunch of those things as we go forward too. But I'm glad you mentioned found family, because when I looked for overlapping themes in this roster of fairly different novels, I found several commonalities, storylines that involved or examined belonging, that concept of home, and that joy of building found families. So, Kathy, we're going to go back to you. It seemed to me that Joan's character arc centers on the desire to truly belong. Can you tell us about how Joan's desire to connect shapes that story?
Yeah, I think Joan is just the kind of person that thinks it's such a shame that there are people who out there who are alone, or rather more specifically, who feel lonely. I think she's very cognizant that life is limited and that most people, or the vast majority of people in the world, are good people and that they deserve to feel connection. So the fact that there are some lonely people out there yearning for connection, I think she just finds that so inefficient. And I think Joan, in her heart, is a very practical and efficient person. I don't know if everyone experiences this, but I personally love to set people up. So like one of my most proud accomplishments is that I'm responsible for multiple weddings. And I'm just the kind of person like where I'm driving down the street and if I see someone walking alone, like I get this insane impulse to pull over and talk to them because I'm like, oh, you know, you look lonely, like we should talk. And I know that that person on the street is probably like, they're gonna say back to me, like, I actually have a very full life and you're probably the lonely one because you pulled over. Like, you're probably a little crazy. And I think that's probably true in a way, which is why I had to write an entire book about it. Right. So I think it just all comes back to that feeling that like there's people out there who just feel alone. Like you sometimes feel alone. And so why can't we just ever kind of reach out a hand and connect?
Thank you. Natalie, a central part of Xiomara's story is the death of her older sister, and the reader sees her struggle to find dependable and healthy relationships. And as part of that, you write frankly about sex, which I appreciated. How does Xiomara's search for care and safety factor into her story?
Yeah, I appreciate you pointing out the way in which I wrote about sex because I did find it to be very frank. I am someone who came from a family who never talked about sex. It was almost as though I remember my mom revealing to me when I was like 21 that she and my dad were actually, in fact, not celibate until marriage. And I was like, wait, you lied to me my entire life. I can't believe you told me that you didn't have sex until you got married. And she kind of had this moment with me where she was like, yeah, I didn't know how, I was young when I had you. I didn't know how to raise you. I didn't know if it was okay to talk about sex with a daughter, and how would we navigate that together. And I obviously immediately really understood where she was coming from, but I also felt that it was such a shame that there was so much shame in talking about something that is so natural. And I think that in grief, you always, and in the grief that Xiomara has, she's consistently looking over her shoulder to ask, hi, Adam. She's consistently looking over her shoulder to ask, like, am I safe? Is someone going to drop dead like my sister did? Who am I? Where am I? Am I okay? And I think that there are moments in the novel where she does, of course, succumb to really scary situations in her sexuality, but I also think that she finds a lot of power in being able to manipulate the men around her according to her own terms when she feels unsafe. And I found a lot of play in that when I was writing. And kind of to Amy's point, like I wasn't 100% sure when I was sitting down to write that that's what I was taking on. But as the character kind of continued to unravel and reveal herself to me, I realized that she found power and a lot of questions in her sexuality, and also used her sexuality as a response to her grief and as almost like a anarchist way of interacting with her grief. She was saying, you took this thing away from me, so I have all the power here. And this is one thing that I can control in a world that feels completely uncontrollable. And so, yeah, she searches for safety and she searches for care. But I think more than anything, she's actually searching and proving her power throughout the entire novel.
Thank you. That's deep. Yeah. Welcome, Adam. We'll kind of circle around to you at the end here, but I'm going to hop next. We're talking about found family to Amy. You spoke a little bit already about kind of writing this large family, but I found the characters in your novel to be a beautiful mosaic of the many different ways that family can form. So how did you build this constellation of found families?
I think I built the constellation from the original core, which is the people who refer to themselves as the greats, and the kids refer to them as the greats. They have always been there. They are the pillars. And they were all really complicated people, some of whom certainly came from my own family background. My great aunt and uncle, to whom I was very close, left Paris during the war and were of both French and Algerian descent. And I think what is always interesting to me is who people love and how they love and who they leave and who you cannot bear to leave, even if you might be better off leaving them. But all those really powerful connections, which for me are all forms of love. It turns out, you know, Richard Rhodes, the historian, said that writers don't pick their subject, the subject picks them. Love is my subject. If I go to an art exhibit, I'm going to look at the portraits first before the landscapes. It's like people, love, language, that's pretty much my venue. And so I particularly loved writing about the people who had joined into the family. There's a character, B, who has nothing to do with these people, nothing to do with them. She is the granddaughter of the real estate agent who sells them their house. But she sees those people and they see her. And even though nobody acknowledges it openly, she becomes the daughter they wish they had had, and they become the parents that she wishes she had had, despite the fact that there's not a lot of enthusiasm for that relationship in the rest of the family. But I'm really interested in the tapestry, and I'm really interested in what gets cut and what gets saved and what gets repaired and what can't be repaired. And for me, with found families, that's just an extra dimension, you know, because there is that element of choice.
Thank you. Allison, Freya returns home, which is both a physical building and also a town full of negative, often traumatic memories. But for me, your novel was all about connection. Freya's deep bond with her niece, the resonance of her deep childhood and teenage friendships. So please tell us about the role of home, belonging, and found family in your novel.
Yeah, it's so interesting that Amy was talking about that thing of really being seen by somebody and how that connection happens. I think, you know, I've been estranged from my family of origin for 20 years. And one of the things I've realized over time, I also write about found family pretty much in every single book I've written, from the first three I wrote as Allie Larkin to the last two that I've written as Allison Larkin. And I think that process of being seen by someone when you can't be loved for who you are by your family of origin, when you have something projected on you by the people who are supposed to love you most, I think what happens is that you have this enduring affection for the people who see you as you really are. And that can be a big relationship or a small relationship, but that affection doesn't really leave you, even if you have to leave that person. And so I think there's like a core trust, a core longing, a core understanding that just doesn't go away. And so I think that that's kind of where I was coming from in writing this. So you'll see characters that Freya's going back to from the bar where she worked. You know, there's like Gus and Shorty, who are some of my favorite characters to write, and they have this very warm relationship, even though they don't interact all that much. And they remembered each other so well over the years that she was gone, because they see each other and they know who each other are, and they accept each other on the terms of how they show up in the world. And that's a really special thing. You know, it's special and it's rare, and I think it's what makes a found family, and turns it into what we need to sustain ourselves.
Thank you. Adam, so in your novel, The Wayfinder, you weave together an epic story of the history and politics of the South Pacific, centered on the Tuitonga Empire at its height. Readers encounter the political seat of power during a protracted war of empire, the stories of a community on a remote island, and the myths that sustain a disparate people. So you're perhaps best known for your fiction set in North Korea with the Pulitzer Prize winner, The Orphan Master's Son. What led you to tackle the seafaring empire of Polynesia?
Oh my God. Well, thank you for that introduction. It's an honor to be on the panel with all of you. And I've got a couple books on my list already. Ancient Polynesia. Actually, I did an event in New Zealand, and I met a Maori storyteller there, and she was like the most powerful storyteller I ever met. And I was like, how come I'm not such a great storyteller? It turned out there were many reasons, that her stories were sacred to her, that they came from the oral tradition, and that they were grounded in real history. And I just became obsessed with the peopling of Polynesia, indigeneity, something that's always interested me, and how people had these incredible technologies to find these remote islands, how they navigated by the stars, how they were completely in tune with nature, with the winds, with the currents. And we think we know so much today, but how much have we lost? How much knowledge of botanicals, of plants, about the harmonics of nature, how to catch a fish or start a fire? And so as I was working on another project, I just would spend every night reading about Polynesia. And that's usually the first sign. I'm usually the last to know I'm writing a novel. I usually get obsessed with something, and I get crazy on eBay buying strange books and artifacts, and I think of it as a crazy passion. But then after like a year, it starts to come out in funny ways, and writing is how I process things. But one of the things I discovered was that a lot of the problems we're facing now were faced by the Polynesians because islands are delicate ecosystems, easily disturbed, and human presence leads to scarcity, extinctions, and that leads to conflict, displacement, internal, external. People have to make hard choices. You can only live on one island, so families have to make choices, communities have to make choices. And I realized that a lot of what we're dealing with today is something that we've dealt with in the past, and it felt very relevant to me.
Absolutely. Thank you. So another theme that I think you all dig deeply into are the ways we inherit and then interrogate our foundational stories. And so, Adam, we're going to come right back to you. Woven through your novel are the myths and legends that guide this kind of geographically disparate people, stories of navigators, bits of history, and snippets of poetry. So can you tell us a little bit more about the role those stories play in your novel?
Yeah, for sure. You know, my grandmother was Lakota, and I never got to meet her. And so, like, no language or culture came down. What does it mean to me to have DNA, but no inheritance on that part of my family? It's always been a mystery to me. And uh, to be in the presence of other people's stories that are powerful, sacred to them, like mattered to me a great deal. And even if those myths have lost relevance in a certain way, but to me they were sacred. They were new to me and powerful to me, and to put them in my work, to be true to the portraits of the belief systems of my characters, meant to take them literally. And so in the Tuitonga Empire, there's a myth of a fan that moves life, and it can, with a waft, give life, and with a draw, take life. And one of my characters has this fan, and it turned out to be a great novelistic technique, um, and it turned out to be a great driver of action. But myths about the ocean, about the size, about the power the king has to take a soul and store it in a coconut, and release it when he likes. That's a pretty handy trick too. Um, and I liked people who believed that power was earthly, and it gave a special meaning to life to know that these things were possible, and that they could really happen on Earth. And it it gave me a sacredness to be able to depict moments like that.
Thank you. I think they added very much like a depth to the rest of the story being told. That was great. Natalie, Xiomara is Afro-Latina, and throughout the novel, she struggles to feel like she belongs in the world of Broadway and musical theater. In many ways, your novel examines the question of who gets to have an uncomplicated dream. So how does Xiomara challenge the story she's internalized about her worth?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Actually, I don't think anyone gets to have an uncomplicated dream. I feel like dreams are inherently complicated. And or at least that's like how I've experienced dreaming and dreams. But I do think that it is about who gets to have the guts and who has the support to make a dream into reality, which is potentially an equally complicated reality, an equally messy reality, but is a more true reality to the way they want to be living their lives. And so I think that Xiomara doesn't feel like an outsider as much because of her race as she does because she lost her sister. And I feel that she really lost her mirror. I had an amazing mentor once who told me that there are people in your life who are mirrors and there are people in your life who are windows. And the people who are windows will encourage you to kind of like look outside of yourself and point externally when there's a problem that arises or when you need to get something to look outside the window. But there are people, and the people who you should hold close to you are mirrors who will say, look inward because you kind of have everything that you need. And so I think this book is more about Xiomara realizing that she's completely lost her mirror. And so in that way, she can't see herself anymore. And so her dreams, not because she's Afro-Latina or because of her race, feel inaccessible, but because she doesn't have access anymore to seeing herself. And so if she can't see herself, then no one can see her, and she feels invisible because she's lost that thing that has allowed her the ability to access herself. And so I guess if you don't know yourself, then you can't access a complicated dream. Yeah.
Thank you. I love that. I love that idea of mirrors and windows, and thinking back on the book, I can see that. Absolutely.
Yeah, totally. I appreciate that.
Amy, your novel has a quintet of characters referred to as the Greats, as you said, and they're the generation that founded this sprawling family and that really grounds them. So how do those characters shape the stories they pass down, both through telling and through withholding?
Well, as I said, I come from a family that was much more given to the withholding than the sharing. I remember saying to my other grandmother, in Russia, you had 7 siblings. When you got to America, I only know 4, to which her response was, yes. And that was the end of that conversation. So these people tell some of the stories. Ghazala never really shares the story of her childhood and her adolescence in occupied Paris during the war. Part of her history is based on 2 Dutch girls who actually existed, who during their adolescence, their form of active resistance in Amsterdam was to beckon to German soldiers and slit their throats in the forest. Those girls stayed with me for a long time. And that is certainly part of Ghazala's history, which she never shares with anybody. Her becoming sort of the tweenie in Colette's household was really based on my terrific interest in Colette, who seems to me to be one of those people that I can only think of as a fascinating, irresistible monster. This was not a lovely human being, but this was an enormously effective writer. And the chapter title is something like My Life with Madame Colette, Beloved Friend, Beloved Anti-Semite. And because people are complicated, as Natalie was saying, people are more than one quality, they are more than one relationship. And all of them have things that they hold back. Honey, who is not from the East Coast, who's from Wisconsin, joins the family when she marries Anne. Again, very complicated on account of, Anne was previously married to Honey's brother, Richard. And all of these people are stuck with each other forever. It's part of my view of family holidays and family parties. And what I come to feel now at this stage in my life is, if you can, invite them. If you cannot, probably stay away from them. But if you can, have them over, if that's possible. It's not always possible. And I think that's how the center of the novel emerged for me. All these people with big stories, some of which they would share, some of which they would not share. There's a scene at a wedding in which the quintet are all sitting around, just cracking each other up with stories about people who are dead, who are long dead, and people correcting each other and swapping details and, swapping, folklore and myth, and building the story and the relationships outward, while also keeping these important things to themselves, some of which get revealed for people in the family much later. There's a theme in which the younger members of the family are coming to the older members of the family as those older members are beginning to fade away, because they are such great people as vessels, right? You can pour your truth into them And those people have reached the point in life where they do not need to have an opinion. They are happy to listen. Although I will say that most of my characters are fairly opinionated, and even if they're not telling you what they think, you probably see it in their faces.
Thank you. Allison, structuring your novel are interludes about Old Bet, the first circus elephant. Can you tell us about using that as a framing device and what you hope it brings to the story?
Yeah, that was an interesting journey because I grew up in the town of Somers, New York, which is a suburb of New York City, but it is known as the cradle of the American circus. And Hackley Bailey brought the first, it was said the first elephant, it may have been the first circus elephant, to the United States. And he was our hometown hero. And I grew up as a kid who understood that a captive elephant is a tragedy. And so that was something that kind of haunted me and kept me separate from people because I felt like the whole town was celebrating this elephant. There's a monument to her downtown. The town hall is called the Elephant Hotel. Um, and I wanted to put something about Old Bet in this story, and I wanted to set the book in Somers because of her. But as I started to research Old Bet, I started to realize that the history I thought I knew, I felt like I was an expert. I grew up in Somers. Of course, I'm an expert on Old Bet. When I was a theater major, I wrote a paper on the circus in general over time. So I approached this thinking I'm just gonna like fact check a little bit. And I realized that I didn't know anything because nobody really knows anything. I would find dates and then I'd find conflicting dates. I'd find dates after Old Bet had already been killed that talked about her being alive. You know, I found even down to Hagalea Bailey's children, I was told that Old Bet was named after one of his kids. And then you go look up his kids and there was no Elizabeth, there was no Bet in some records, and there is in other records. So I wanted to frame, there's a paper that Freya writes that frames different sections of the book. We get a little snippet of the paper in each section, and I wanted to use that as a benchmark for history in general and how our own histories aren't exact either, that the perspective of the history being told is very important to take into account when we are thinking of our own histories, and who sometimes the loudest person or the most powerful person is the one who controls the narrative. And so my awakening in that, you know, not that I didn't realize before that history is skewed, obviously I did, but seeing it on this very small level was chilling in a way, and it made me examine personally the perspectives of my own history, and led to having Freya do that as well. And so that structure kind of allows me to deal with the truth, both as a story of Old Bet and as a very personal story too.
Thank you. Kathy, throughout your novel, Joan thinks back on her upbringing and the way her mother treated her. How does the push-pull between her mother's opinion and her own sense of self-worth drive Joan's story?
So Joan's mom, who is in Taiwan for the whole novel, she's a very cold, even cruel person. She expects Joan to regularly send all her money back home and be obedient and do everything she says, but she doesn't really seem to love her. Joan's mother definitely doesn't approve of the fact that she gets divorces and then marries again, this time to a much older American man. I think she very much regards Joan as a disappointment and a failure. Um, and I think what I really wanted out of this book was it to feel authentic to how someone of Joan's generation, she was born in the 50s, would have actually thought about the situation and what a realistic outcome would have been. Sometimes I read novels set in the past, like you'll read a novel set in like the 1800s, and it feels a little bit like millennial coded. They'll be like musing about their psychological safety or something. And in this, I really wanted the relationship here to feel real, like of that generation. Which is to say that I don't think there was ever going to be a moment of catharsis or real justice for Joan in this situation in her relationship, since in a lot of ways Joan does agree with her mother's assessment of herself. She agrees that she's kind of a disappointment and a failure. But I think what makes her interesting or compelling as a character is that while she agrees with it, she's a little just like, this is the life that I've ended up with, that I've chosen in many regards. And so I'm going to make the best of it. And the book just really follows her as she attempts to do that.
Thank you. So we have about 8 minutes left. So this is our last question for you. I could talk to you all for many hours, but we don't have that for today, unfortunately. So I want to talk to you all about settings because you've all created such evocative settings in these novels. I'd love to hear from you about any research you did and how you infused such a depth of place into the work. And Natalie, we'll start with you. Your novel takes place in New York City, and Xiomara is deeply tied to her Washington Heights neighborhood. The city feels almost like another character. So how do you approach writing these places in your work?
Yeah, my research for it was just living my life. I grew up in New York, and so I have a vivid memory of being in my grandmother's house. She lived on 176th Street and Broadway in Washington Heights, and I have 42 first cousins, and all of us were always at my grandmother's house. It's crazy, but I have 8 cousins, and the 8 of us are like inseparable to this day. And we used to have big family parties, and then all of the kids would hide in my grandmother's bed and we'd pretend we were sleeping. And my parents would come in and they would say like, oh, the kids are sleeping. I guess we'll have to leave them at mama's house. And then we'd all be like laughing under the covers. And in the morning, we'd play this game where we'd all chew, we'd buy gum from the bodega downstairs. We'd chew the gum and we would stand at my grandmother's window and see if we could spit it onto someone's head. And that was how I spent my childhood in New York. And that is how I wanted to make my version of New York feel. Like, I remember while I was writing this book, just thinking like, that's my New York City. It's full of like fun, especially with Washington Heights. It's not this like downtrodden place. It is like so deeply full of life and music and just like nostalgic kids throwing gum on like different cars and people's heads, and people would be yelling at us, but we all took care of each other and knew each other. And so really wanted that to be my New York, and that was my playground. And so I hope that it came across in the book that that's my New York. And that's every time I wrote a scene about New York, I just like closed my eyes and I was like, if this feels like that morning at my grandmother's house, then I did my job. And I think I did.
I think you did too. Amy, you mentioned this a little bit, but the first part of your novel is set in occupied World War II era Paris and includes real life historical figures like Colette and the jewelry designer Suzanne Belperron. Tell us a little bit about your research and why you chose that time and place to anchor the story.
I think I chose that time and place because it's central to my family history, but also because, as Allison was saying about history, you know, it depends on who's telling it. And my dad was adamant that history is written by the winners, and that he was a journalist, and that my job as a person, not just as a writer, was to be able to sift things out, to try to see things as they might have been. And my aunt and uncle who left Paris were so appalled by so many things that in America, Maurice Chevalier would come on the television set when I was a little girl, and somebody in my family had to stop my aunt from throwing a vase through the TV set. And I'm sitting there going, you know, Gigi, straw hat, cane, charming accent, a little creepy, but still probably okay. And my aunt would go into a stream of French, Yiddish, and Russian abuse about what a collaborator he was. And so there are all these little pieces of history. You know, the interesting thing to me about Colette, whom I loved very much when I was a younger reader, was that she was just sort of, you know, very haute bourgeois, Parisian, anti-Semitic, except that she was madly in love with her third husband, who was Jewish, you know, who she had to protect. And all of the things that she went through and all of the groveling she did, all to protect this Jewish man that she loved, whom, as she said, turned her into somebody she did not know. So I got to go into the bowels of Yale and spend tons of time with the ephemera of World War II, which was extraordinary to me. To hold the posters that people had to put in their cafes that said on one side, no Jews with a terrible caricature, and on the other side had a picture of a German soldier eating a cookie and smiling and waving, was an extraordinary experience for me. So
Yeah.
research, for me, research is like walking through a fascinating garden. You know, there are things that you notice, there are things that you skip. And I think, to speak to part of what Natalie said, I think even when you are doing research from another period or another place, it is also the life you are living. You bring yourself through the garden. And that for me was just a wonderful opportunity.
Thank you. I think that's beautiful. Allison, your novel is indeed set in the home of the American Circus, Somers, New York, which is also your hometown. Tell us briefly about writing your hometown.
That was a little nerve-wracking. I've written about places I've lived before. I haven't written about my hometown before. And so there were moments where I had a bit of stage fright and felt like, oh my gosh, people are going to think I did that in that place and this happened to me. Um, but it was also an interesting, especially having moved cross country to California, and the landscape is so different. It was such an interesting experience to revisit my hometown in my head, and understand what made it special and what made it strange. It's a funny place because for a while it was summer homes for people from New York City to come up, and then they eventually kept extending the train line, and it became those summer homes became converted into year-round homes, and that's kind of a strange landscape. And I hadn't realized that because where you grow up is your default. And so having this chance to re-examine my default was really helpful, and it made me so appreciative of the landscape and how that shaped me as a person. And I had a really good tree when I was a kid, and I think that that tree was very important to me. And I also got to have this lovely connection with my friend Mike Cerulik from high school, who is still in Somers. And I would text him and be like, okay, are the swans on the reservoir right now? I need to know that. And he'd send me a picture of the swans on the reservoir and how much ice was on the water and things like that. So it was an unnerving experience. It's a little weird to think about this book going out into the world, and it was also a really wonderful experience to make sense of myself and where I came from and how that shaped me.
All right, we are unfortunately just about out of time. I'm sorry I didn't get to Kathy and Adam on the setting questions, but you both have very evocative settings. I hope that everyone attending the panel today checks out these novels. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Next, we have 2 concurrent mini panels, Imagining the Past and Women in History. Happy reading. Thanks for being here.
Bye, everybody.